Hello and welcome. I'm Joanne Law, Director of Mediation Institute, and this video was recorded during International Mediation Awareness Week 2025. Really would like to welcome Richard Johnson. He's one of our members and has volunteered to do a very interesting talk on the diagnosis and treatment of intimate relationships. Richard is a mediator, family dispute resolution practitioner and clinical supervisor, but also a counsellor, and has many years of leadership roles across a whole lot of sectors regarding health, aged care, disability and community services. I will hand over to you, Richard, and I think you're going to do an acknowledgement. Over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Joanne. I'm starting to feel a bit old listening to you.
It's a common element, many of us.
Yeah. All right, let's give the acknowledgement, which is acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from where we variously come from. For me, it's on the Sunshine Coast, which is the Cubby Cubby people, for their elders past, present and emerging. Thanks, guys, for attending today. I was concerned whether anyone would be interested in this topic, but it's great that people are here. Hopefully it's going to be helpful to people. If not to yourself, for some of your clients or people that you know. And thanks also for the Mediation Institute for allowing me to do this. This is the second edition of a book I've written on this topic. The first one, I didn't really promote it all that well because I thought, I don't know whether it was actually something that people would be interested in. Also, I was a bit put off because I titled it Pulsating Love, and it could have got a lot of the wrong interest from an audience. They were looking for something a little more spicy than the topic that I was presenting. Feel free to ask questions as we go, because I'd like to know whether this is hitting the mark for you. I'm here to promote my book, my second edition of this topic. But I'm also not here to drive revenue or anything. That's not my aim in presenting. It's to get whatever wisdom is in the book to be distributed to people who might find it helpful. Where I'm at in my career, I'm at a point of looking at legacy. When they reach the end of their careers, they wonder about, look, what have you left behind? I would like for people to be able to pick up bits and pieces of what I've learned over the years that they might find useful. I'm going to talk today about the book, the drivers for the book, where it came from, how it originated, and how it fits into my personal and professional life. Then go through the structure of the book as to how it might be useful for people in their professional practice. So it looks at intimate relationships from a commencement of a relationship right through to when the relationship may come to an end, which is where I'm working in this space at the moment in family dispute resolution. And it's probably where some of the audience today will be interested in as well. I want to go through the topics because I'm finding that even in mediation and in the screening and assessment process, you're coming across a lot of issues with regard to their interpersonal relationships, whether their former relationship or current one, or even in the process of mediation itself, where some of the dynamics at play can be discussed in detail rather than the actual content of the mediation. It's the process of the mediation itself. And this is what the book tries to cover. I do a little bit of relationship training in the screening and in the individual meetings I have with clients, particularly in how they're going to approach their mediation in the way that's going to hopefully give them the best outcome. So let's talk about the book. Back in, I think it was about 2018, 2019, my youngest son went to America because he was following the love of his life. And he was marrying into a really wealthy family. And I was feeling quite intimidated by this because they were talking big dollars and big presents and big wedding. And and big gifts about how this is going to go. It was kind of outside of my league in terms of their economic status. Anyway, what I thought at the time was I might write a book. It's going to come from the fact that my two elder children had got married and they had both gone through divorce. I thought, what's happened with those guys? I've been working in this field now for 40 years. I've been married for 44 years and happily married. My wife and I still get excited when we go out. I thought, what's happening with my own children that they can't maintain their marriages? And then here's my youngest son getting married. So I thought, well, I can't match financially these big gifts the Americans are pouring into this wedding, but I've got something else. I've got the history of life that I could give my son as a wedding present. So I put fingers to keyboard and started writing the book, the first edition called Pulsating Love, with the idea that I would present this at his wedding, which I did, and it was gratefully received. That was 5 years ago. They're still married and seem to be chugging along, I'd like to think. During that same process, my daughter, who'd gone through a divorce, said to me, Dad, in all your wisdom, never helped us to resolve conflict in our own relationships. I went through a period where conflict between spouses were done in private. We didn't do it in front of the kids. And when myself and my wife had issues, we just went aside and we dealt with them. But in doing so, not realizing that my kids weren't picking up skills with regard to identifying problems and how to resolve them. She challenged me and said, you really never taught us how to do relationships when they get difficult. I thought, well, that was a bit of a challenge as well. Hence putting that together as a personal sort of driver. That was the start of it. The second driver was more professional. As Joanne mentioned, I trained as a counsellor many years ago, got the counselling degree and the master's degree, and was deemed a professional counsellor. When it came to doing relationship counselling, I thought I could do a lot of the controlling the session and organising the balance of making sure the participants or the people in the relationship had equal airtime, were listening to each other, and were communicating clearly, could keep the tension out of the session, and supposedly was an expert because I had the qualification. But then I began to realise that although I was good at counselling, I really wasn't sure where the sessions were going, what was actually happening in the relationship. I was finding it difficult to identify the difficulties and put some sort of professional therapeutic framework around the particular issues that people were having. It was left for years of going to weekend workshops and reading books to try to get a clarity on what the segmented issues are in a relationship that I can really hone in on to say, aha, that's what is going on in this relationship. And therefore, that's how I can then develop some sort of remediation that may be able to help the relationship. So it was a bit scattered, but over the years, you just get better at it. And I thought part of the driver of this particular book was to compile some of these things into the typical issues that relationships come across in a way that's easy to define, easy to read, and then put some strategies in play to say when these things start to emerge, these are some of the ways to deal with it. Or alternatively, being aware of them even before they start, to say we need to be on guard as we venture into this area of having an intimate relationship. What are some of the things that are likely to emerge during our time together that we could then focus on? So putting the book together was part of that as well, to say, well, this is a great legacy to leave to the profession so that you can say, like a textbook, I can identify the particular difficulties a relationship is having before I have to sort of figure it out by myself. It's actually, I can say, I'm now aware of what I'm listening for. I'm listening to hear about codependency. I'm listening to pick up issues of domestic violence. I'm looking at betrayals and I'm looking at communication issues. And then I can say, okay, that's what's going on here. And then working with the relationship to actually resolve it. One of the things that dawned on me, having now worked in the mediation space for the last 5 or 6 years, that a lot of my work in relationship counseling, particularly in the initial stages, was actually mediation. It was mediation work to identify the issues that were happening in the relationship. Mediation started to take shape, and then I started to think, well, actually, this book could be helpful for mediators as well. So thanks to the Mediation Institute for letting me do this. So that's kind of the biggest part of the drivers to putting this together. If you get a chance to think, look, that might be helpful to us. I'm also saying to the guys earlier that if you think, hey, I wouldn't mind getting a copy of this book to have a look at, either for myself as a professional or as a self-help guide to my clients, or even for someone I know, send me an email and then I can send you a book directly. If you go to Amazon, what they are charging is not what I thought was appropriate for the book. I'll give you my email later, and just send us an email and I'll arrange for you to get a book. That's part of it in terms of setting up the writing of the book. Like I was saying, it's the second edition. The first edition didn't include any case histories. Some feedback I got was it would be better if you could have fleshed this out a bit further with real life examples. So the second edition actually has some case histories to say this is the way these dynamics are being played out in practice, in real life. So I'm going to talk about the structure of the book and how that unfolds. The first premise of the book to keep in mind is it's based on the concept that a healthy relationship requires a sacrifice of giving and a sacrifice of forgiving. They're the fundamental driver for the therapeutic interventions and the health of the relationship. When I'm writing the book, I'm leading people towards the idea of this is not a transactional relationship. The relationships that are based on transaction are on shaky ground. So the whole idea is identifying the transactions that are taking place and then shifting that out of that arena. Often in mediation, you will see that the people who come into mediation are coming from a transactional paradigm. They're thinking to themselves, I came into this relationship with particular needs, individual needs, and I'm willing to engage in this intimate relationship for as long as those needs are being met and it's healthy, and vice versa. I'll help you meet your needs. And it's very transactional until suddenly things get unwieldy, and then the individualism comes to the fore and the relationship itself as an entity is gone by the wayside. So I'm trying to address the issues of intimate relationship in a sense of the relationship is an entity in itself, and it's based on the idea of giving and forgiving. I have to sacrifice my individuality, and I have to sacrifice in forgiving the other person when things go awry. So it's countercultural in our society where we are driven towards individuality from the get-go. We're conditioned to think about ourselves and how we achieve our goals in life, etc. Everywhere you look, it's about developing self-actualization. The relationship itself is just something else that I enter as an individual. I'm adjusting that premise as much as I can to say, hey, we can actually look at the relationship as an entity in itself. The book's based on externalizing the issues or depersonalizing the issues. When it comes to diagnosing, it's trying to look at the issues as separate from the actual individuals, separate from the relationship. They are issues in and of themselves. So a lot of the way the book is written is to depersonalize, to encourage people to stop using personal pronouns around issues, your attitudes, your values, your beliefs, your behaviors when you do this and when you is trying to depersonalize it all and come up with, look, this is what's actually happening. When it's depersonalized, then the people involved can have a more objective view of what's happening in the relationship. And then from there, discuss in a more rational, reasonable way some of the interventions that could take place in remedying the issues that come up. So that's the premise of the book. The structure of it is not clinical, it's not technical. In fact, some of the issues that you would read in it, you could write volumes on one particular issue, and you could look at a lot of technical stuff around domestic violence, managing your finances, and dealing with infidelity. And you could just keep writing and writing. It's not a textbook for professionals at that level. It's a book written for simplicity. It's trying to take out the jargon of relationships and saying, these are the everyday language issues that are happening in people's lives. They go into depth, but not a depth of technical sort of dynamics. It's about what happens in individual relationships. I'll talk about that a little bit more when I go through some of the topics that I covered. But keep in mind, it's meant to be
Richard, can
simple.
I ask you a question?
Please do.
So, obviously, from what you've said, it's around intimate relationships and the more personal relationships. I'm a workplace mediator, so I was wondering whether there'd be anything transferable into workplace relationships, because of the mediations I do are around interpersonal conflict.
You could transfer it without a doubt, like going into a mediation, just looking about depersonalizing issues, like I was saying, just a straightforward, if you can, in a workplace, depersonalize the dynamic that's happening in that situation rather than making it personal. There's technique in doing that. For example, putting the in front of the issue rather than your behavior, it's the behavior, the attitude, using simple language to depersonalize. That's an example you could apply anywhere. Being able to communicate in a way that's not blaming, not accusing someone, simple communications that you could read and say, if you're going to approach a difficult workplace situation, you could set them up right away with the ground rules of how you're going to communicate as you would in dealing with an intimate relationship. When it comes to some of the, like right at the end of the book, I talk about sometimes the relationship itself has got to end. It becomes untenable, and probably what you find in our workplace as well. Some of the relationships, work colleagues, suddenly it's untenable. How can these people continue to work in the same office with each other when they reach this point? Well, I'll go through some of the topics. The structure is about, I've used the analogy of the human heart, simply because years ago I trained as a registered nurse, and I was registered for 10 or 12 years. When a heart surgeon is looking at a heart condition, they hone in on they segment the actual condition of the heart. They look at particular diseases of the heart that has been studied over the years. They segment it and treat it. They don't just treat a heart condition, they hone in on exactly what is going on in the heart that they can treat that will then heal the whole heart. So I use that as a metaphor to say that relationships and the difficulties in relationships can be segmented. They don't have to be, I'm having relationship issues. What does that mean? It could mean a whole range of things. Or I'm having communication issues, like if you can deal with your community. Well, that's all big sort of global statements, but they need to be defined and segmented. So the structure of the book, each chapter, I've picked a particular disease or a condition of the heart and use that as a metaphor for defining the relationship problem that relates to that. I'll leave it up to you or the reader to see how successful I am at that. The issues in a relationship can be segmented or put a boundary around it. They're not issues that are going to infiltrate the whole relationship. Those things that we can actually deal with. So that's the structure of the book. For example, I'm just going to check my notes here to make sure I stay on track. Yes, I want to go through some of the topics in the book and give you an idea of how it goes. Start off at the beginning with the early stages of a relationship. Now, this may not interest you, Emma, in terms of starting a romantic relationship, but I guess it could still apply in a workplace. You do go through a bit of a honeymoon period when you first join into an organization. You'll think it's hunky-dory. But the idea of when people enter into a relationship, they enter in the expectation of it being long-term. And when the initial passion starts to wane, they begin to think the whole dream of having the long-term commitment in the relationship is starting to be lost as well. The first part of the book, challenging the passion, what I call the fetal heartbeat. When a baby's first conceived, its heart rate is really racing 120, 130 beats a minute. It's all exciting. And that's when you're first coming into a relationship. And I just talk about that in terms of expectations, that's an unrealistic expectation to have. If you want to go the long term, you're going to have to look beyond the passionate side and explore the different phases of love. Love is not just this, it actually encompasses a whole range of other things. So at the beginning, right at the end of the book, then I'm going into the idea this relationship has become untenable, that separation is now required, and this is where the mediators may find it useful. I discuss some of the major areas of co-parenting and property settlement, some of the issues that need to be addressed when separating a relationship. The family dispute resolution practitioners are probably familiar with those topics, but I've covered them off in there as well to say that if the relationship is going to come to an end, then this is some of the things that need to be discussed. Throughout the book, there is a high emphasis on the respect that's actually required, even when dealing with high conflict. How do you actually deal with high conflict in a respectful way? And then even in separation, can you actually separate in a way that's dignifying to both parties? So if it gets to that point, then it's important that you actually do it well. And this is how you can do it well. There's a lot of references around that. Now, everything between those two bookends is about dealing with stuff within the relationship. So, for example, I'm just going to pick on a few things to give you a bit of an idea. So in one chapter, I talk about the cardiac embolus. For people who are familiar with some sort of anatomy and physiology, an embolus is something that originates in the bloodstream that then lodges itself in the heart. It's like a foreign body that doesn't belong in. I don't know whether there's any doctors or nurses here, but they know what I'm talking about. It's an intruder. I'm looking at chapter 9. I'm talking about the embolus in a heart. It'll stop the heart from functioning. In fact, it can give a sudden death to somebody if it's not treated well. So I talk about a cardiac embolus in terms of some of the intruding factors that can come into a relationship, things that a relationship may end up coming to have to deal with. Now, I'm just sort of flicking through here, and now to give you a bit of an idea, I'll talk about things like a person's work becomes intrusive, their career, their hobbies become intrusive. I'll talk about how some of the things that intrude into the intimate relationship are probably the very things that attracted the person in the first place. But after the years have rolled on, those things have actually become a major hindrance in their intimacy. Family and friends become an issue, addictions, ghosts from the past, the previous partner. I mean, those who are in the mediation space know how much you're developing a wonderful parenting plan for someone, and then within weeks, they say the wheels are falling off, they've taken it home because the new partner is concerned about the previous partner and how that's intruding. I'm talking about how some of those things interfere in the intimacy. Concurrent relationships is another intruder. You know, what happens when the affair starts? How do you actually deal with that? Is that the end of the relationship? I'm saying in the book, not necessarily. I even have a chapter on a stab wound to the heart. What happens when there's a major betrayal, infidelity, a sexual encounter outside of the relationship as a stab wound? That's a major illness in a medical setting. But strange enough, people actually do recover from a stab wound to the heart physically. So I use the example, if there has been a huge breach of infidelity, made a unilateral decision to make a purchase, or it's some real breach of a non-negotiable in the relationship, can you recover from that? And the answer is yes, you can. These are some of the things you will need to address to start to recover from that. If there is a concurrent relationship, a third person in the relationship, how do you deal with that when it comes to light? Is that the end of the relationship? Some of the conversation in the book is about trust and about how to look at trust as a flexible commodity as opposed to a black and white commodity, like I trust the person or I don't trust the person. I'm never going to trust them again. I always trust this person. You know, people that are familiar with this language knows that that really is unhelpful. It's going to lock them into a particular course that is got an inevitable outcome. Right.
It'd be interesting to explore that issue of trust a little bit more because it's such a huge thing that happens in any type of mediation.
Absolutely. Yeah, well, the idea of introducing flux of trust as a flexible commodity is one that I use regularly. I use the idea like a thermometer. It goes up, it goes down, and then may reach a threshold of never to return. But even then, you would hope there is a possibility of rebuilding trust. And it fluctuates. You've got to take steps, build trust over time. And you've got to demonstrate your trustworthiness over time. It's not going to happen if someone says, oh, I'm never going to do this again or whatever. That's not realistic. One of the things that I really didn't focus well on, Joanne, was the predictive function of our minds in terms of we are predicting all the time. We're predicting how people are going to behave. We're going to predict the responses that we're going to get from our conversations, the words that we speak. We have this predictive mentality that we take into our relationships, either helpful or not helpful. So when we start to predict a positive response and it becomes reliable, we build up trust. When we start to predict a negative response from our intimate partners, it even becomes self-fulfilling. What I didn't discuss in depth is how pervasive our predictive capacity is and how it either helps or hinders us. We'll start to predict the intentions behind people, that why they do certain things. You know, our minds are doing this all the time. And if we can challenge our assumptions on our partner, then it can actually unlock a bit of the difficulty that's unfolding. Part of the book, I think it's in chapter 4.
Richard?
Yeah.
Also, it's about, the patience, the loss of patience I have seen in the relationship. If the patience is less, you are hard to understand, you are hard to listen to others completely, thoroughly. So for that, it is also a very important aspect to have patience, calm within yourself to understand other point of view and their perspectives. What I mean to say.
A lot of that comes from your past assumptions, your past experiences in an intimate relationship. You end up drawing upon your past life and missing out. You're preempting the moment and the future because of your past. If you can challenge that and help the person get mindful awareness, hey, I've got to stop doing that and start thinking more, what actually is happening? Is there another way of looking at this and interpreting that other than from my own sort of position? So that's kind of covered in chapter 4.
Well, it's glad you're sharing it with us. It's so common, isn't it? People all have a whole conversation with the other person without ever talking to them.
That's exactly right.
I completed it and they got a bad answer and they're going to act on it.
Nah, that's about right. Now I'm talking that some of the issues in there is I say the heart transplant, but The analogy around that is relocation. A lot of people come unstuck when they relocate from their community, from an environment around, from their family, which live close by, into a whole new community in such a transient world. The dynamics come into play, either hold that relationship together or suddenly it becomes the things that were holding it together. The glue from their environment is no longer there when people start moving around. I call that the heart transplant. When you move from the community of friends and family that you've come accustomed to and into a completely new community, I guess the holes or vulnerabilities in your relationship will start to come to the fore. Warning people that when you relocate, it'll either drive you closer together, but it can also start to have your relationship unravel. I talk about that. I talk about the death of a child. And I call that a myocardial infarction, when there's a death of a part of your heart. I'm using the metaphor of the heart throughout the book. I'll focus on what happens when there's a death of a child in your relationship, some absolute tragedy. There could be a major disruption in your relationship and your predictive capacity is suddenly thrown out because you weren't expecting that particular dynamic to happen and you can't prepare for it. So how do you actually deal with that when it happens? That's what one of the chapters is about. Oh, I've talked about the betrayal, but then, yes, the separation stuff, that's the part you need to look at. Now, the idea of the mediation process is gearing people up to have a conversation with an intimate partner from the past, particularly if they've had children together. Some of that hurt is going to constantly come into the fore in terms of the relationship, and how do you actually manage that when you're separating? That's nearing the end of the book. When is it time to reach out to get professional support? The other thing I need to mention, in the language that I use, I don't think I've used marriage at all as a word in the book. I just refer to it as intimate relationship. Now, what I'm trying to do is, because a lot of the clients that come through in mediation are not married. They may have been living together for years. So I don't want to sort of assume that everyone's married, but certainly the dynamics that are at play are the same, whether they're married de facto or what it might be. The problem is that once you've got something published, suddenly things come to the fore and you go, oh man, I wish I would have covered that better. I like the idea that the relationship is what I'm calling now a collective consciousness. Rather than people coming into the relationship and maintaining their individuality and negotiating a great relationship as individuals, it would have done well to push it harder to say, once you come into an intimate relationship, you are developing a collective of that relationship. When I'm hurting and I'm hurting you, we are both hurting. It's a one hurtingness. And I think that could have been fleshed out a bit more. I heard recently about the silent divorce. I didn't cover that well in the book, about so many people, particularly in the Sunshine Coast, there's probably elsewhere, are separated living under the one roof. And that's now become such an issue that I think it could have been covered in the book better, about how do you actually have an intimate relationship, still living in the same roof, but then in a separate...
Richard,
What's that?
what would your metaphor be?
Oh, right. I'll think about that one.
Cutting the heart in half and sewing it back together.
Yeah.
Upside down.
Right at the end of the book, I couldn't come up with a metaphor for long distance relationships because they're common. People are actually separated, living overseas or in separate communities. Put that as an appendix. If you're going to sustain an intimate relationship long distance, these are some things to consider. Long distance could be temporary, a week or longer. There are certain vulnerabilities that come into play when you have a long distance relationship. And I talk about how do you actually protect yourself against, the unwanted intruders into a relationship when trying to sustain a long distance relationship. I did talk about the athlete's heart, which came, I think, prior to separation, which is the long-term relationships. And I talked about the dynamics that come into play when people have been together a long time and the I guess, the shortcuts in their communication, some of the undignifying things that happen in long-term relationships when they lost their passion for each other, but they want to stay in those relationships, and some of the things that you'll never experience unless you do stay in a long-distance relationship. There are some things that will come into play after you've been together for 30, 40 years that were not present in the first 10 years. The wonders of that, but also some of the tragedy of that when it becomes really difficult and almost abusive in terms of not caring and not seeing your partner the way you've seen them originally. So that's called the athlete's heart, the person who can run a marathon and their heart rate just doesn't get high anymore. And I'd like to put in there, even at the beginning, that the idea of getting your heart racing with your intimate partner, even after 30, 40 years, is actually still a good thing to do. So that's the book. I need to warn people, it's culturally narrow. It's, from my perspective, it's white, middle class. In the last 6 months, I've had a number of people come in for mediation separation from India. There've been arranged marriages, dowries, and all sorts of stuff to sort out. Yeah, it just became aware to me that the book is actually written from a particular Western point of view. You know, I'm white, middle class Australian. I'm a bloke as well. It's probably written from a male's perspective. So if you read it, you might pick up, well, hang on a sec, he's not addressing some of these other issues that are quite prevalent.
What jumps out at you, Richard, as examples of things you've encountered that are different?
What was the first word?
I'm just wondering if there's anything, what specifically are you thinking of you've encountered?
Yes, I come from the assumption there's no male leader. For example, I look at the metaphor, the chambers of the heart function together, right? There is no one dominates and says, I'm the leader. And that's the assumption in the book. There are two sides of the one heart functioning together. Some people coming from different cultures do not see life that way at all.
Not a proper relationship, but
yeah, it's a different
Very
one.
interesting to compare it with the medical aspects as well. What about your experience when you have got the Indian cases for mediation? The psychology and the case which you have just discussed, which you have got from India, something you can tell about this?
Well, the first thing I notice is that often the problem arises because one of the partners has become more westernized than the other. So suddenly they've been exposed to, I guess, a culture where it's more like what I'm describing, particularly for the female involved. I don't have to just put up with things anymore. I want to say in the matter. And that creates its own tension and has led to the fact that they then think, I don't even want to be in this relationship anymore, even though my family back home are telling me that I have to stay in that relationship. So now I've got to separate it. The dowry, I think that one regularly pops up, particularly if there is some cultural expectation that the dowry gets paid back and what that looks like. And then what happens if there's infidelity in that relationship? Does that negate the dowry? I find that often the guy involved, well, in fact, I've had probably in the last 3 months, 4 Indian, and in each case, the guy is not wanting the relationship to end. They're the ones that want status quo usually under his conditions.
Are you seeing that as well in India, Vinta, that relationship dynamics are changing, or are still things more traditional?
In India, I'm in family mediation since 2010. I'm dealing with a number of cases. When I was in Delhi Dispute Resolution Society, every day you will receive 7 to 8 cases like that, and of all classes. So the experience is that the dynamics has changed, obviously, what you mean to say. And the way of thinking and their relationship, intimate relationship, they are working on it, but it is coming through more westernized. Earlier it was more like the traditional, what he says is about diary and other things, more traditional. But now the understanding and the lack of many things which we can see is making the relationship more complicated. When you mediate, you need to see that either the marriage is going to be between the parties and the later stage, 31 or 32 at the age of that. Both has the individual concepts and they have a kind of, you can say, the stubbornness or the thing which they don't want to change for each other or something, which is understanding, lack of understanding, love or trust or what you say for each other. So there is a conflict arise and you need to settle those things in the mediation. Most family matters are there. In India, the main thing is the interruption of the family also. There are backs of traditions, values, and various, the caste, religions, and other things. So you will get number of interruptions from their side. You need to settle those aspects as well. I have means in Australia, I had done some FMC mediation also through FMC. I have done that, and India I have done with DDRS and then MCPC, Supreme Court of India. I'm in panel there, so I have seen various of the difference between Western and Indian, which is very interesting. That is the reason I asked this question to him. So
Yes.
it's really nice to share and
Yeah.
meet with you all.
Yeah.
That's great.
Very
So that's not an area covered in this particular book in terms of an Indian audience. That's what I'm thinking where the book could be helpful to people. It's for clients. It's a bit like, there's a book called, I think it's Bruce Fisher, Rebuilding When Your Long-Term Relationship Ends, and it tries to discuss things you need to do differently. In the mediation space, this book fits into that category as well. The thing that stands out in my mind is you're sitting there doing your individual meetings or mediation session, and the thing that crosses my mind, and I don't mean to sort of big note myself too much, but I thought to myself, if the people in front of me today could have known about this sort of stuff years ago before they got to the point of no return, they wouldn't be sitting here in front of me today. They could have resolved some of this stuff. That's where I think it's worth recommending to people to say, hey, if you don't want to go through this same scenario yet again, prepare yourself better, or even encouraging, as in my case, my children, I think I want them to be better prepared to go the distance, to experience what it's like to be in a relationship for 40 years and enjoy some of the benefits of that.
wonderful. Thank you. So we've only got a couple of minutes left. Are there any other thoughts or questions from anyone in the background who's not able to come on screen? Oh,
Yeah, I've got a question, Richard. I think now society, money is the number one driver for relationships. So if you don't have any money, unfortunately, you can't do much. Puts a lot of pressure on the relationship.
Yep.
So unfortunately, back in our day, we had a car and we could go on holidays, and now two people are working to pay off a house. So that's, to me, it's that number one.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, so
And unfortunately, the love comes second. And that's the shame of it, because society is turned out like this. Yeah.
Look, I do have a chapter 11 called pericarditis. Pericarditis.
It's coming up a lot. There you go.
Yeah, well, that's right. Each chapter's got a metaphor to it, but the pericarditis is finances and property. If you're coming into a relationship, you're going to have to discuss finances and property. So there's a chapter on that to say, how are you going to address these things, particularly when you've got different values on money? Some, big spender likes to buy versus someone who likes to budget. How are you going to address that? So there is a chapter on finances with the idea
compromise.
Absolutely. The idea is to depersonalize it. It's not about you and your values. It's about we need to discuss the finances in the to try and externalize it and have that conversation around it.
It's about us.
Yeah.
Not you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wonderful. So the challenge for the rest of the day, Mamay's thrown it out to be using analogies and metaphors about the heart for when you're talking to
Money
I'll leave that up to you.
Extreme of anything is bad. If you don't have money, it's an issue. It's still a big issue. So what we have also noticed here in mediation, sometimes the matter comes when they have very less money and there's issues, and sometimes they have enough money and it creates a problem. So this money is really a big issues in family mediation also. We are correct.
Absolutely. Because I've got a minute to go, I just want to sort of go back to what Andrew said a little bit to challenge it in the sense of underestimating the value of, if you like, the higher level of, if you like, spirituality in a relationship could transcend the mundane. And right at the end of the book, I talk about that as well. If a couple can transcend the actual issues, there's a lot of power in that deep connection.
That's a nice thing to end on.
Yeah, serenity now.
Thank you, Richard, for such a nice book. It's really nice and good to hear today. Thanks.
Thank you, Richard. I've popped Richard's email in the chat, and I'll pop that on for those. Oh, sorry, info at FairShare. Sorry, Richard.
That's the one.
Personal. So should be the info at fairsharemediation.com.au if you do want to touch base with Richard. Thank you once again.
Thanks, Joey.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.